I'm just curious, before we start off, we're going to be talking about Peter Singer and Tom Regan. Show of hands, who here has read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation? Okay, so a decent amount. And who's read Tom Regan? Okay, so a little more Singer than Regan. As Paul mentioned, Singer and Regan are kind of some of the early workers in the field of animal ethics. They kind of got things going. This picture kind of gives you a sense of the dates they were starting from, the late 1970s. That groovy guy on the left is Peter Singer, rocking the big stash. That's Tom Regan next to him, and some other guys who did some work in animal rights. So my plan for tonight is to do a brief overview of Singer's, some of his arguments, and then we'll look at some of his other positions and then his utilitarian approach, consider some objections, some concerns and worries, and then do the same with Regan. Look at his rights-based approach, consider some objections and concerns, and then finish with some evaluations, and hopefully I don't talk too long and we can have some questions after that. So Peter Singer, he published an important work called Animal Liberation in 1975, and it ignited kind of a lot of work in this area of animal ethics. Now, a lot of the book just kind of documents how animals are treated, but the central arguments are pretty interesting, and those come in the first chapter of his book. So one of the biggest things he argues for is this idea that animals deserve equal consideration of similar interests that they have with other beings. So in the first chapter of his book, Animal Liberation, he considers what is it that makes racism and sexism wrong. And what he argues is that racism and sexism are wrong because they pick out morally irrelevant features, someone's race or someone's sex, and they give them moral importance. And so what Singer argues is that when we show prejudice or discriminate against animals, he thinks we're doing the same thing. So speciesism he defines as a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. So Singer compares speciesism to racism and sexism, and he thinks there's a similar logic in terms of what's going on. So when we recognize this, when we recognize that species membership is this kind of unjust form of discrimination, he thinks there's a presumption in favor of giving every being equal consideration for like or similar interests. So we can talk a little bit more about just what that means in practice. But it's not going to be the same thing as equal treatment, and that's important to emphasize. So different beings are going to have different interests. Most human beings have a strong interest in having an education, but that's not going to be the case for pigs, right? So not every being has the same interest. And it's also important to note that his arguments for equal consideration are not connected to any sort of overall ethical theory. So it's going to fit in well with his utilitarian theory that we'll talk about in a bit, but it's not, it could fit into other theories. So for Singer, what matters is the capacity to suffer and also to experience pleasure. And he draws the kind of moral line at sentience. So plants, for Singer, don't have moral status. They don't matter because plants don't have interests in the same way that you and I or other animals do. They're not subjects who experience the world. They can't be harmed. They're not conscious entities. And so as a result, they don't have the sorts of interests that sentient beings have. So we can note that this sort of argument for equal consideration, the focus thus far is just on the capacity of beings to suffer or to experience pleasure, and it's not on whether or not they have an interest in continuing to live. And it also, Singer makes it clear he doesn't think the rejection of speciesism implies that all lives are of equal worth. Okay, so after presenting this argument, he considers a pretty common objection, right? One most of us has heard, humans are special, right? So we differ from non-human animals in a number of ways, and some people think that these are morally relevant and sometimes argue that they necessitate, more significant or perhaps even exclusive moral considerations. So sometimes people point to the rationality of human beings or complex language or our strong sense of self-awareness and argue that either we should have greater consideration of our interests because of that or perhaps exclusive consideration of our interests. And so the reply Singer gives is a sort of argument that's often called the argument from marginal cases. So as we'll see, this argument has somewhat of a bad name, I think. But the way it works is this. You pick whichever capacity it is said to separate human beings from non-humans. So rationality, for example. Whatever capacity you pick, it's not going to be the case that some humans possess this capacity, right? So if you take rationality, babies, infants, many people who are older and also severely cognitively impaired human beings aren't going to have this capacity. It's also probably going to be the case that some non-human animals have this capacity. So if that's the case, if all humans don't possess this capacity, and if it's also true that some animals do, then it cannot be the case that all humans deserve greater consideration than all animals. Now, the way this argument's mostly run is to say that because all humans do deserve significant moral consideration, then we should grant the same moral consideration to animals with comparable capacities. So what should we make of this argument? The first thing I think is it has a bad name. So marginal cases implies that these human beings are kind of infrequent or only at the beginning and end of lives, but often many of us will be these human beings. We were these human beings, and many of us will become these human beings, and there's also a lot of people who are these human beings throughout the duration of their lives. So the name doesn't really reflect the kind of diversity of human beings. Another thing to note is many take this argument to be quite powerful. I know, just in terms of kind of a personal anecdote, when I first encountered this argument and the idea that a non-human great ape or chimpanzee could have the same capacities as some human beings was a very powerful consideration. But some worry that the argument could go the other way. And so particularly some people working on disability worry that given the historically bad treatment of people with cognitive disabilities, that this comparison of those individuals in particular to non-human animals might be problematic. So that's some of the debate over this argument, but it's not clear that we actually need this argument to establish quite strong moral status for animals. So we can talk later in terms of the value of using this sort of argument with other people and in terms of engaging them, whether it's useful or to be avoided. Okay. So far we've talked about the argument that Singer gives for equal consideration. But this in itself doesn't really tell us how to act. So to get from giving equal consideration to how we ought to act and how we ought to live, Singer puts forward a preference utilitarian account. So preference utilitarianism is a type of utilitarianism, and it's a form of consequentialism. So what consequentialism says is that an action is right if it produces the most good or best consequences. So the emphasis is on the consequences of our action, and it's only the consequences that determines whether or not an action is right or wrong or good or bad. It can be specified in different ways. So there are different aspects of utilitarianism. One is an account of the good, so an account of what makes life good for human beings or contributes to our well-being. For Singer, that's going to be the satisfaction of our preferences. And by preferences, he just means like our wants, our needs, our desires. So that's part of utilitarianism. The other part is the consequentialist part, that we ought to maximize this good. So we should maximize the satisfaction of preferences. And then the last part is the impartiality. So this is the kind of equal consideration. We ought to give equal consideration or equal weight to the similar or like interests of all beings that could be affected by our action. So when we take all those elements together, on Singer's view, we should act so as to maximize the satisfaction of preferences for all those affected by our actions. And that's the view that's known as preference utilitarianism. Oops, jumped ahead. Okay. So before talking about some of the practical upshots of that, I just want to talk briefly about Singer's views on killing. So one of the kind of more controversial things, particularly among animal advocates, is Singer's views on killing. And so far, our focus, we've talked about the ways we should give equal consideration to the interests of animals. But Singer thinks that not every animal has the same interest in continuing to live. So this is different from the interest a being has in not experiencing pain when it dies. He thinks all beings have that sort of interest. But if we think about circumstances where a being could be killed painlessly, That's what he has in mind. And Singer thinks that killing persons, whether human or animal, is going to be worse than killing non-persons. So he uses the word persons here a little differently than some philosophers. So in the most recent edition of his book, Practical Ethics, when he says persons, what he means are beings that have some sense of self-awareness and some sense of the past and future. Sometimes when philosophers use that term, they kind of pack a lot more into it. And it's not just a sense of self-awareness, but it's a very strong sense of rationality and the ability to use language. And that's not how Singer's using it here. At least that's not how it seems he's using it. So Singer thinks that non-persons, beings that aren't self-aware, that don't have a sense of the past or future, or very weak sense of the past or future, are replaceable. So it wouldn't be wrong to painlessly kill these beings. But just how kind of far is the scope of this? Singer interestingly says that he thinks many animals that humans eat very well might be persons. So in Practical Ethics, he says that pigs, chickens, and perhaps even fish might qualify. They very well might have some sense of self-awareness and some sense of the past and future. And he also says that many animals, these animals and perhaps others, should be given the benefit of the doubt. So if it is the case that we have good reasons to think they might be persons, then we should avoid eating them. So that's kind of his general view on killing. And the reason I should say that he thinks that it's only persons that have an interest in continuing to live is because only persons have a sense of kind of identity. They're individuals, whereas beings that are just kind of experiencing the world, if they were to be cut off from existence, the idea is that they're not being wronged in any sort of way. Okay, so what are the practical upshots of Singer's utilitarianism? Well, one thing he thinks is that we should stop eating animals and animal products, and we should do other things to end the suffering of animals. So things like educating others and engaging in activism. And the reasons we ought to do these things are utilitarian reasons. So we should work to maximize the satisfaction of preferences for all sentient beings. When it comes to animal experimentation, Singer's views are going to be a little more complex and nuanced. It's not a full-scale rejection of animal experimentation. So he thinks that many experiments that we conduct on animals can't be justified by utilitarianism. So many of the trivial reasons we experiment on animals won't maximize the satisfaction of preferences. And also many experiments we undertake that might have kind of beneficial medical results won't be justified because we have no knowledge about whether or not they will lead to the maximization of the satisfaction of preferences. But in theory, he could justify animal experimentation if the kind of empirical realities line up. So if certain experiment you had knowledge that could lead to the maximization of preferences, and that involved conducting harmful experiments on animals, Singer would accept that. But he does advocate for shifting funding away from research on animals to clinical research on consenting human patients and then other research methods. Okay. So concerns and objections. There's a lot of ways you can object to utilitarianism, and I'm not going to go through all of those. Probably one of the biggest objections is that utilitarianism and even preference utilitarianism might allow for the persecution and oppression of minorities and also individuals. So the idea is, look, there might be situations where minorities or individuals could be persecuted, and that would still lead to a maximization of the satisfaction of everyone's preferences. And that we take to be a problem. Another objection is the idea that all preferences should count. So you might think that the preferences some people have in watching, an animal at a rodeo, for example, being ridden about or something like that those preferences shouldn't count when they're dependent on, the suffering and subjugation of other animals. So for Singer's utilitarianism, all preferences are going to count, but you might worry, if that's how it should be. And then you might worry about that his views can justify animal experimentation, kind of on similar grounds to those. And then there's also problems we can raise with Singer's views on the ethics of killing. So one issue is that it doesn't cover all human beings. It's probably not going to be the case that very young babies or infants would count as persons. So if they were orphans. There might be some situations where it wouldn't be wrong to kill those beings. Most of us would take that to be a problem. And there are more preferable accounts of what makes the ending of a life or killing wrong, beyond just non-persons. So some accounts point to the kind of ending of the, cutting off a being from the potential to have future valuable experiences or things like that, that would be able to cover all beings.